Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Carol Kauffman, and I'm here as the founder of the Institute of Coaching, and also as a new colleague of Cynthia, as I'm now a senior advisor at Egon Zehnder, which is a leadership advisory firm and an executive search firm that's global. And what I'd like to invite you all to do is visit instituteofcoaching.org and look at some of the things that we offer. For fellows, we have huddles twice a week and more. We have thousands of articles and just lots and lots of ways where we try to reach out and help elevate the field and help you with your practices. So I'm here with Cynthia Soledad, and she and I know each other very well. She's the co-lead of Global Diversity, Equity, and the Inclusion Practice at Egon Zehnder. And before that, she was in marketing and nonprofits for about 20 years. Cynthia, things have changed a lot. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing today and what's brought about the changes from what you were doing before.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. I do like to share because I've gotten to know a lot of chief diversity and inclusion officers over time, and it's interesting. Everybody has a story about how they pivoted into this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm no exception to that. I had a journey into this work as well. My prior life, I was a consumer marketer. And I think in that world of consumer marketing, you learn a lot of things. You learn to listen. I think you learn to listen for differences in experience. That's what inspires new product development. It's what inspires, really resonant advertising campaigns. So that was my old world. And as an employee, I was also really involved in employee resource groups, which a lot of people are familiar with that concept and context. But I married all of that together. I think I've long had a passion for culture and for understanding differences in culture. And as an employee resource group participant and then leader, I had a passion for creating more inclusive work environments as an executive, but didn't necessarily know how to drive change in cultures. I appreciated maybe what good looked like, but not necessarily how to help an organization move from point A to point B. So I think today that's a lot of the focus of the work that I do. So I wear actually a couple of different hats in the role that I play today as the co-head of our DEI practice. One piece of it is actually, along with my co-lead, we serve as our firm's chief diversity officer. So I'm thinking about how we move our organization from point A to point B. We are on a journey, as other organizations are too. I have the pleasure and privilege also of working with chief diversity and inclusion officers on their own career journeys. So I lead executive searches in the space and help companies define this role and find the right talent for the role. And as well, I work on strategic engagements on inclusive leadership to help. And so I partner with chief diversity officers and HR leaders on company journeys and help them to advance the journey. So it's a little bit of my story and how I came into the work. And I think what's very common for people who do this work today is it does start from a place of personal passion, perhaps personal experience and identity experience, and certainly a lot of empathy for other people's experiences. And that leads to wanting to be a part of driving evolution and change.
Yes, and I know for a fact how well you've been doing that. So, I mean, it's been quite a past few days with the whole trial and everything around the murder of George Floyd, and the whole country is in a place of reckoning with that and social justice issues. And as a result of that, certainly we've seen companies really focusing on DEI like they have never they've never done before. Can you share with us about how did that impact the role of the Chief Diversity Officer?
Yeah, it has been quite the year of reckoning, as you mentioned. And I think, so a couple of things I think have evolved in the role itself as a result of the intensity of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. One is, frankly, the role has become yet more visible, more senior, more strategic for a lot of organizations. And frankly, there are a lot of organizations that are creating the role for the first time. So we've seen in the market, an expansion of this field So roles are being created, roles are being elevated, reporting structures are changing. And I think there is an acknowledgement as well that there is a very strong, and there should be a strong connection between diversity, equity, and inclusion work and business impact and business strategy. And I would say that link has been, less consistent over time. Actually, one thing that might be interesting to pull up, we'll have fun with Zoom a little bit. Let me pull up a visual that might help to describe what is in the role today, because this has evolved as well. Just the structure of the role has changed, and the focus areas have changed. So if I may, let me just pull this up and people can see this. And I'll pull this back down so we can continue our conversation, Carol. But this is just a helpful visual, I think, when you think about what this role is and how it's evolved. I think historically, the role of Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer was very focused on diverse workforce and inclusive culture. And as I was mentioning, I think what's been happening is a closer tie to the business. This role has become more strategic. And that has led to a closer tie into the actual commercial strategy of the business practices, as well as thinking about how the company ties into social impact, right? The community engagement, the ways in which the company can play a role in changing systems outside of the company itself. So internal and external impact is now a part of this job, a much more consistently a part of this job, and that has then evolved the types of experiences I think that people are looking for folks to bring into this role. As I mentioned, the role has gotten more senior as well. So I think just seeking the level of executive gravitas in this role, the ability to influence at the board and CEO level has gone up in this role in this past year. And maybe the final impact that I would talk about is, frankly, because of that, the demand for people who bring significant functional depth and experience in this role and who have been doing this for some time has gone up significantly. So I'll tell you, working with talent in this space, they will share with me they have had more inquiries from outside about, would you consider a different role? Can you help us structure this role? Can you help us find talent for this role? And within their own companies, a greater investment of the senior leadership teams in helping to support change in the organization. So they're getting more resources in their current roles than they've had before, which is quite an incredible shift in the past year.
Great. So a couple of things. I'd love for you to explore a little bit more and kind of flesh out the kind of the role of the Chief Diversity Officer, what you see them doing. Yeah. And then we have some really great questions here. So I'm just going to add one of those in here, which is someone has asked, what are some ways in which someone can prepare to become a Chief Diversity Officer? Programs, training, certificates. So let's first hear about how you see the role and how you could prepare for it. Because I'm sure some of the people here, could be preparing for roles like that themselves, but even more of us are coaching people. So it'd be very helpful for leaders and coaches to hear both the role now and how to prepare for it.
Yeah. So if everyone can sort of call to mind again that 4-quadrant visual that we had before, I'll talk about the structure of the role in those 4 quadrants. The internal pieces, diversity of the workforce and inclusiveness of the culture, right? So the role and responsibility of the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer really has first to do with what is the diversity of representation we have in the company today? What does good look like, in the future? Most companies would say we are not sufficiently diverse today, perhaps at a whole organization level. And very, very often, even if at the bottom or the middle of the organization, there's a lot of diversity present in the workforce, that diversity doesn't carry through all the way to the top of the organization. So thinking about that whole talent pipeline up, in and up. And so the DEI leader is interfacing very consistently with other HR practitioners and HR functional leaders, oftentimes, frankly, reports up to the CHRO because of that responsibility for the diversity of the workforce overall. But then, of course, a lot of the reason the title has shifted to include the word inclusion in the office itself, right? So these used to be chief diversity officers. Now, very often, they're chief diversity and inclusion officers, because I think there's a recognition that you cannot benefit from the diversity in the organization if you don't have a sufficiently inclusive culture where those differences are really celebrated, right? So we like to talk about inclusion as that state where people simultaneously feel unique and different and a sense of belonging. That is true inclusion. And so you can have a diverse organization where people don't feel comfortable bringing their unique perspectives fully into the conversation. And then you have a diverse workforce that you may not be able to retain, right? Because people actually don't feel that their diversity is embraced, celebrated, a part of the conversation. So that too requires a really strong partnership with not only the HR functional leaders, but the leaders across the organization, right? What do we collectively need to do to build an inclusiveness of the culture? And so you can hear in those internal responsibilities, some of the preparation, so we'll bounce back and forth between your questions, some of the preparation that is really helpful for these roles does have a lot to do with, getting into human capital systems and getting into, what does it take to build to build a diverse pipeline into the organization and a diverse pipeline up to senior leadership. The coaching and development side of that, for example, is a piece of that. When you think of
a little more, when you say getting into human capital systems, why don't you double click on that a little bit and how that relates?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people go first to recruiting, right? So whether that means recruiting at an early stage in career or recruiting externally, even at more, middle management or senior management, there are practices of recruitment that from an inclusive recruiting practice point of view, you want to think about, are we addressing all possible biases in the way that we recruit talent into the organization? Are we looking at diverse slates? Are we building interview panels that are made up of diverse perspectives so that when we make hiring choices, we ourselves are evaluating that talent choice from multiple angles? These are some examples of best recruitment practices. So that whole body of recruitment practices is a piece of it. Another big piece of it is talent development, right? So what we hear and see a lot is there can also be possible biases in the way that people are identified as high potentials in the organization, people who are going to live on succession benches for big roles, who get investment in their, no, you're fine, and get investment in their development. So acknowledging that some of those systems need to be looked at and repaired for possible biases as well. So that's what I mean when I say thinking about all of those human capital practices, from recruitment into the organization, development up in the organization, and recognizing that some of those systems, maybe need to be made to be increasingly inclusive, need to be evolved over time. And that's that strong partnership between DEI and HR practices.
That's great. So in and up, and the partnership that you need. So do you want to spell out a little bit how the Chief Diversity Officer interacts with the Chief HR Officer, and what kind of range are you seeing in that?
Yeah. And this continues on that, exactly the theme we were talking about on the internal side of the responsibilities for Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer. I'll say first, in the most common reporting structure still today is for this role to live in HR and to report up to the Chief Human Resources Officer. There are other reporting structures that are in practice today. They're just less common. So, for example, in some companies, this role is a peer to the Chief Human Resources Officer and also reports up to the CEO. or to a chief operating officer, an owner of the business. In organizations where the role, the DEI officer sits within the HR function and reports up into HR, that's where there's heavy emphasis based on where the company is and its maturity on DEI, and saying where we really need to make impact and drive change is on the diversity of our workforce and the inclusiveness of our culture. And those companies may not be quite as far along on the maturity journey to say, we're also going to think equally hard about external impact. So that means that the partnership with HR is very much the foundation of the role. That's why it reports up to the HR officer. It is a peer to other members of the HR leadership team, et cetera, and works across those different functions to optimize all of those talent processes and practices that we were talking about. In other situations where this role maybe is a peer to HR and reports up to the CEO or the chief operating officer, or chief administrative officer, I've seen these different models. That's where perhaps the organization is wanting to have as much focus, or nearly as much focus, on the external impact side of the role. And you're thinking about this role is also interfacing with the community, with perhaps elements of the corporate social responsibility and philanthropy strategies of the organization. So those are, not directly HR processes and practices. That's why it ends up being a peer function to HR. Regardless, this is a very, very strong partnership. This is whether it's a direct report to or a peer to a chief human resources officer. It's a critical relationship. And it's one I get asked a lot of questions from chief diversity officer candidates to say, tell me a little bit about where the HR function is on their maturity journey. Tell me about the philosophy the CHRO in this company has on DEI. Is this person a natural collaborator? Are they still learning? Is this somebody that I'm developing on their DEI journey themselves, or what will that relationship be like? Because it's such a critical one to drive change.
I just have to tell you, A, this is so interesting. B, as I'm looking at the Q&A, I have never seen such sophisticated questions. So guys, thank you for doing my job. I have a list of questions, and yours, frankly, they're sort of better. So I'm going to do some of those. I love this one. Oh, there's so many here that are so good. Any recommendations on how to handle people who are skeptical of our work and its importance? And what about handling people who question our competence because they don't see the results or the initiatives or the languages that they want to see right away? So how to handle skeptics? I love that question.
Yeah, and this is probably one of the most difficult parts of this role. I think people who have lived the role would say they encounter skeptics every day. There's a lot of conversation, has been a lot of conversation around the business case for diversity, right? And some people are, really, when their skepticism needs to be addressed through, show me how this is going to benefit our business. Show me how, the organizations who are doing this well today, how have their businesses benefited? So I think this is always a role of incredible responsibility to influence others. And I think, like other roles, when you encounter those skeptics, you're trying to address their questions in the way that they process information. So this can be sometimes—
That's a really, really good point. Slow down and talk about that, because you're talking about bridging with people, and also the challenge of bridging with people when you feel that they're a bit possibly even hostile to you. So what you just said, I think, is very important. Can you?
Yeah. So double clicking on that a little bit. So there will be those thinker types who are data oriented and who want to see the evidence in the numbers of the importance of this. And I would also say those numbers can take different forms, but there's still this data orientation to it. There may still be numbers in an engagement survey. There are numbers, right? At the end of the day, that data is about how people feel in the organization, but it's still data. So utilizing that data on how people feel, what is the representation in the organization, how will yes, there is data also on how businesses are positively impacted by bringing diverse teams together successfully, but a data orientation mindset is one way of influencing. There are others who are more the lover, right? And whose hearts can be opened by some of the data in an engagement survey or in an individual interview is about a human experience. Actually, we've seen so much more in the past year of people being very generous and sharing some really difficult personal experiences they have had of not feeling a sense of belonging in the workplace.
Lovely.
Or not just, a more extreme element of that, feeling a sense of being rejected by an organization or a person, coming back to their identity. And for some, hearing those personal stories, those heart-opening stories, have cracked the code into the importance of this work. So, those feel like two very different ends of the spectrum: a data orientation, a relationship or caring orientation. I think for some, this is about winning a war on talent, for example. So thinking about that warrior mindset, if you want to win in this competitive atmosphere, best talent comes to our organization and stays in our organization. So maybe addressing that warrior type and the competitive spirit that some leaders have may be the way in. I think that great chief diversity and inclusion officers think about all of those different mindsets and have to be agile in transition from one influencing style to another, depending on what's going to crack an individual leader's code.
That's so interesting about what you're saying. It's sort of the opposite of irony. It's so lovely in alignment, which is, for those of you out there saying you're being kind of attacked or you're feeling under a lot of scrutiny because of your commitment to diversity, at that point, to be able to have diversity in how you're responding to that person. Will data work? Will the story work? Will the sense of belonging work? The engagement. So I think that's really fascinating. So also for everyone, I want to just give you a little bit of a double click on the language that Cynthia's using. At Egon Zehnder, they have a partnership with a group called Mobius, which is this, they do these like incredible programs. And they talk about people are sort of four types. There's sort of warriors who want to lean in and engage, thinkers who want data to lean back. They call lovers, which basically is relationship oriented, or they're dreamers that are sort of visionary. So just to give you a backdrop to the language that Cynthia is using.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Carol. I thought of maybe one more point just to add into this mix on influencing what I've heard from others that is successful. I think chief diversity officers are also trying to help leaders make personal connections to this work. And again, that's where which angle of personal connection matters most. Is it going to be that we need to win in the market? Is it going to be, that I care about my people? But at the end of the day, any one of those avenues of influencing is to try to connect the purpose of this work to a senior leader's individual purpose as a leader in this organization. And when you make that connection, then you get their commitment to the work.
So one of the things is, so those of you, if you visit our site or have ever looked at our logo, you may not notice it's a bridge. And the whole idea is the importance of, so Cynthia, what I hear you say is I'm here and you're the person who I want to influence. How do I walk over the bridge to you and then maybe back up to kind of help that person see my world after I've seen their world? So thank you for all of that.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful visual. And I think, this is a role that is all about empathy. It's deep empathy for the people in the organization who are, impacted every day by choices on, how we manage talent and the culture that we want to build. And it is also empathy for the leaders who need to go themselves on a journey of understanding what those experiences are deep in the organization. But being able to empathize deeply and walk across that bridge to senior leaders, that even those who are skeptical and those who you want to take on a change journey, and maybe they're earlier in their change journey, so it's harder to walk across that bridge. But at the end of the day, I do think the most successful, folks who are able to also have the energy, the resilience to do this work, because it's hard emotional work, and you're doing emotional work on many ends of that spectrum, right? You're doing emotional work to help people who are feeling disenfranchised stay in the franchise. You're doing work to help people who are maturing in their journey do that work and go on a journey. So yeah, it's a labor of love that requires a lot of empathy on all sides, a lot of bridge building.
And also what I'm hearing is the journey is, how do you help someone understand the world from the other side of the bridge, as they're trying to, bring in talent, up the talent, shift an organization, but also how to turn them into allies.
Right.
And also
Exactly.
to
And
not
champions. Yeah.
champions. So here's another question, and this is by Nancy Harris. Hi, Nancy. Everyone else, by the way, I didn't say her name because it says anonymous attendee. So you don't want to say hi, anonymous attendee, but hi, Nancy Harris. Here's her question. How do we ensure that the accountability around DEI doesn't just fall on the CDO leader? And then oftentimes becomes the job of the CDO and the HR versus accountability and actions from those senior business leaders that you were just describing. So how can you help people think about that?
Yeah, and I think there are different models and experiments that are being run on exactly this point, because I do think the legacy of this role that we collectively are trying to change is it has been sort of shunted off to the side, somebody else's responsibility. And frankly, oftentimes somebody relatively junior in the organization who didn't necessarily have the power of senior level influence. So when I talked about the shift that the role is having, an elevation in seniority, for example, that what goes along with that is ability and license to engage consistently at a senior level in the organization, at a board level in the organization. And so that accountability meter is definitely going up in this past year. So some experiments that we're seeing run in order to drive that accountability. One is there actually are more organizations who are experimenting with tying monetary incentives, right, bonuses, etc., to actual outcomes and results in representation, in inclusion, in the same way we've done for financial metrics in the organization. So there's more and more experimentation there. I think the other piece is engaging, and we do a lot of this work. We facilitate leadership teams immersing in the current state of their organizations and aligning around a leadership team vision for DEI. So it's no longer this is a chief diversity officer or HR project that the senior leadership team is at arm's length to. They're engaged in the process. They're the ones who are setting the vision. And then they're saying, HR team, DEI team, frankly, other functions as well, we are asking you to engage in delivering this objective that is a leadership team objective. Mm-hmm. So that's another shift. And then I think another one, just from a pure, how do we organize the work perspective too, there are things like councils, right, and committees that are built in organizations very intentionally to bring senior leaders, not just HR leaders, but business leaders together to cross-pollinate, to say, how in your business unit are you doing against these metrics, right? We're gonna come together and share ideas so that each one of our business units is making progress. So those are 3 examples that I've seen and that we've been a part of helping organizations to build, to make sure that there is more accountability, more engagement, that it's not, that the DEI is not a project shunted off to the side.
Yeah, and that speaks to one of the questions here by Jean-Claude Noel, who asks, and this is a tough one. How do you ensure that the role is real, sustainable, and integrated? And basically, he doesn't use these words, but it's versus fad, temporary awareness, like other kind of chief roles, like the chief happiness officer, which sort of was rising, and then you don't hear about it as much. But yeah, what you do to kind of really keep long-term traction.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously in some ways we're at the beginning of experiments to drive greater long-term traction. So, I think we'll have to see how some of these experiments play out. I do think a couple of things that I think have felt really important to candidates. So, and I'll talk too about candidates that are moving into new roles. And when they are asking me questions around like, am I going to be set up for success? Am I going to be able to drive the impact that I know is the responsibility of this role, right? So let's put it in that frame. So some of the things that are important. One is let's talk about team, right? So historically, this is a role that has been an individual contributor type role. So with recognition that actually there's a massive scope to the role. If you're trying to drive cultural change and you're trying to evolve, business practices and talent practices all across the organization, that's giant, And so the idea that one person or one person with a team of 2 or 3 would be able to do that by themselves is that's being challenged, right? So a lot of conversation around how do we structure this work so that it is sustainable, so that we can drive the impact that we want. And now that in some organizations, that is about building an actual like DEI team that reports up to the chief diversity officer. In some cases, it is about ensuring, there's maybe a network, across this organization, and it's a bit decentralized. So I'm not saying there's one model of success here, but there has to be that conversation around what is the model we're going to use that allows us to spread our impact deeply and widely across this organization so that we can see the sustainable impact that we'll have. I think another piece of it that has evolved over time is being able to analyze things, right? Being able to actually collect data and see how that data moves so that we can be more accountable for our progress and change collectively. So we all know that in so many facets of our work, there's more data available now than there ever was before. That's true in DEI practices as well. There is more data available. And I think there's more of a practice of trying to listen in the organization and hear what's happening in the organization. I'll even name, like, COVID has been a part of that change too, right? Where probably many organizations are doing more frequent pulse checks than they ever did before on how people are feeling, because we're also separated. That benefits the DEI mandate as well. So collecting that data, watching that data, structuring the work helps to drive sustainable impact. And I do think, again, I get a lot of questions from candidates to say, is there openness to investing more in this work by getting more data, by building teams, by building structures? Am I going to get leadership engagement and involvement when I say these are the things we need to drive progress?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's I don't know, it's a great answer. Now, Gretchen Vulich says, what advice would you give a company or executive whose company, the company celebrates uniqueness, but employees do not feel that sense of belonging? So I think you see that a lot, this kind of gap. You see that also, like, the cynical among us see a vision and mission statement and go, really?
Right.
You got it. You have some kind of business challenge. Are you going to remember this? So for this one, what do you do when you see that kind of gap?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things that different companies are employing. One, which, it feels tried and true because it's been in existence for some time, but I do think we're even getting better at the practice, but it's this concept of employee resource groups that I mentioned before. So I was a member and a leader of employee resource groups, back in the days when I was a marketing executive. And the power of these types of groups, one, it builds a sense of community and belonging, which particularly if you if you hold an identity that is in low representation in a company, the importance of being able to build community around that identity, it means so much, right?
Mhm.
But then the other thing that I think employee resource groups do is they also build bridges. So we talk, I've had some colleagues who say wonderful things about sort of the importance of bonding and also the importance of bridging, building those bridges, having people understand the unique experiences of people who hold different identities. And the employee resource groups end up being, in many cases, the voice of the employees and their unique experiences in the organization. And if there are experiences where people um, are not feeling included for different reasons, that could be, sometimes there are truly benefits and policies that would make a difference in people's sense of inclusion. And sometimes there are things that are more nuanced in the ways that we lead and the ways that we collaborate. We need people to know, XYZ behavior really impacts people that hold this identity. And we need you to know that this is happening in the organization. So employee resource groups really do play a helpful role in bringing that voice to the fore. And then, as I mentioned before, I think many more organizations are getting better at listening. So I talked about listening tools like pulse surveys and engagement surveys, and I do think that those things are important, and I think that they're more frequently being used. An evolution of that practice is to collect that data, asking people how they identify. So when you slice that data, you can actually see differences in experience. Do I recognize that, the people of color in the organization maybe do feel differently than white colleagues in the organization? Can I parse that even further to say, I see how Black employees feel differently from Asian employees, feel differently from Latinx employees in the organization, LGBT, identifying with a disability. Am I collecting the data that allows me to see those differences? So that's at a quantitative level through survey work.
Yeah.
And then I also think there's much more listening that's happening, which I think people are really grateful for, at an individual level. That there are more outlets now to tell one's personal story safely. And I think that practice, would be wonderful to see that practice continue. And creating safe spaces for those stories. Sometimes that means, it's helpful to bring in an outside person to ask some of those questions. That helps to create a safe space. Sometimes it's about having a really well-established DEI office. They create a safe space. There are different ways to create those safe spaces, but I think people are looking to be able to share their stories and share their voices and experiences in a way that senior leadership will really hear them and recognize sometimes that gap between what the senior leadership aspires the culture and the experience to be and what is lived in the organization today.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you spoke to sort of listening through data and the very different experience of different subgroups, but then you've got the kind of diversity that is invisible.
Yes.
Because you've really been talking about diversity that can be seen in some way, although not always in terms of gender identity. But we have a question here from Ryan Mayer, who says he's a certified ADHD life coach, and a lot of his clients are neurodiverse.
Yes.
And one, I'd really love to hear how DEI involved with that. But he's also pointing out that they are afraid to share their diagnosis for being targeted, even though they're allegedly protected. So yeah, how do you think of neurodiversity involved with here? And again, with that sense of community and safety. So what's your experience been?
Yeah. So I'll say first, and we have the privilege to do DEI work globally. And one of the things that's very interesting to see when you look at this at a global level is how the conversation expands into different forms of diversity over time. The sort of classic maturity model that we've seen many times over is the diversity and inclusion conversation starts with gender. And for global companies, sometimes that multinational diversity. It starts to evolve into race, ethnicity, and then evolves into other forms of diversity, to your point, that are not visible, right? So we start to get into gender identity and sexual orientation, and get into identifying with a disability. And that those definitions of identifying with a disability also are expansive in nature, right? So we're not just talking about physicality, we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about mental health, those kinds of things. So it matures over time. And so the organizations that are most advanced in the conversation have expanded their practices to incorporate all of those different levels of diversity, that full range of diversity, which is awesome to see.
Mm-hmm.
I think a couple of things. One is what a lot of organizations are starting to do back on the data collection front is when they ask questions about people's experiences, and they're asking questions, please help us understand who you are as you answer these questions so we can see people's experiences through these different lenses. When you ask people if they identify with a disability or a different ability, you see that there's also, initially, there are a lot of people who would say prefer not to respond. And so even starting with looking at that number, right? What percentage of the population prefers not to respond to that question can be a little bit of an insight, or, on how inclusive is our culture today? Do people feel safe answering an anonymous survey to say, I identify this way, or do I prefer not to respond? So that's a really interesting first kind of diagnosis opportunity.
Actually listening to silence.
Right. Listening to silence. That's a great way to put it. It's a great way to put it. And then hopefully as organizations can build the inclusive culture such that people are more comfortable revealing more of themselves, then you start to hear more and more insights about what is the support that we need in order to feel like we are bringing our whole selves here. Mm-hmm. We are getting the support we need, and that support looks very different. There are different, some of it is really workspace related. What kinds of support exist in the physical workspace to acknowledge and address different kinds of neurodiversity, of less visible disabilities or different abilities, et cetera. So some of that is physicality, some of it is benefit oriented, right? What kind of support are we providing people? Let's think about mental health support as an example.
Well, that's exactly my next question, by Ann Deaton, who is talking about how do CDOs pay attention to mental health in a way that might be different, say, from a CHRO?
Yeah. Well, to answer that question specifically, I don't know that it is different from the way we'd want CHROs or any HR professional to view it as well. I think what's happening today still is there's sometimes in the way that the function is organized, there's an assumption that the DEI leader and the DEI team, they are the home for sort of the center of excellence model on all forms of being inclusive across this range of human diversity. And the HR leaders are still learning from the DEI leaders on how do we think about inclusiveness across all of these different practices. I can tell you, I talk to a lot of DEI leaders who say, my nirvana is to work myself out of a job, because everybody that I interface with is actually thinking in exactly the same way I'm thinking. When I'm thinking about being inclusive across the spectrum of neurodiversity or mental health issues, I actually would love for there to be a future state where I'm not seen as a center of excellence and people are asking me what they need to do. They are bringing those ideas themselves because they've done such wonderful listening and they've gone on their own personal learning journey in this space. So I'll say that first, just in terms of the relationship between DEI and HR. Many DEI officers would say, my goal is to work myself out of a job one day. And then I think, again, thinking about mental health, I think first, building an inclusive enough culture that that we collectively are naming that all are welcome here, extending into people who identify with having mental health challenges, right? Who have suffered from depression or anxiety. And listen, I think we're all suffering from some of that, especially in this year. So building benefits and policies that support the needs that people have, recognizing that those are real needs. And we are not bringing our best selves to work when we are operating under that cloud. So the more the company can provide a supportive environment and supportive policies to help us be our best selves, mental health wise as well, makes such a difference. I'll say something too that might feel tactical, but is very real. Our company, Egon Zehnder, this Friday, we are having a mental health day. It is a holiday that is about people taking a bit of time to themselves. And we've seen other organizations doing similar things. So being able to just name, we are an inclusive enough environment that we are openly going to recognize people need rest. They're exhausted. We want you to take that time. That means so much to people.
That's wonderful. So here's a different slant completely by Peter Wolf, which is, I love this question. What advice would you have for breaking into a DEI role, not from HR, but from organizational change management? And that sort of brings us to a little bit to how, back to your kind of recruiting hat, how can you bring people along and sort of invite them to that role?
Yeah.
And know how to get there.
Yeah. So this is a great question. And actually that phrase change management, I haven't talked enough about, I think, in this conversation today. This is such a role of change management, right? It's individual change, it's team change, it's organization change. So absolutely change management experience is incredibly powerful and important. And if one comes into this role without having had significant change management experience, then you know that you have to go on a development journey and need the development support of others to learn, how do I effectively drive change in this organization? But let me back up into a slightly different point, which is like the different avenues from which people could come into this role. HR is definitely one for the reasons that we've talked about before, but I've seen people pivot into this role from the business, right? From P&L leadership or marketing. I've seen people pivot into this role from legal, actually, particularly, if you're in the employee relations, labor relations space from a legal point of view. So people have transitioned into there. I've seen people transition into this role from other forms of consulting, right? Other forms of organization consulting and organizational development and those kinds of things. So those are four, very frequently seen paths in. I think increasingly we'll see paths in from corporate social responsibility, from communications, right? Because again, there's an external impact to this role that is more and more recognized. So if you have an external impact sort of role today in community affairs, for example, these are the types of experiences that are increasingly relevant for this role. So I think when there is, and there are many companies, by the way, who want to invest in helping people make a pivot into this DEI function. That's another way, as I said, in the past year, this function has really expanded. So people are growing the teams in their organizations, and it's such a competitive market for people who have experience already in this function. One other way for companies to invest in building the teams is by developing people internally to make a shift, right? So having, you mentioned before, like, yes, there are some certification programs and there are more that are popping up. There are definitely networks of experts who meet on a regular basis to share best practices. I think anybody who's been doing this work for a while would say, like, I don't have all the answers. Like, this is about people coming together and sharing different ideas, different experiments of what's working. So being able to come up a learning curve in the function just by networking externally is really, really beneficial and powerful. I think many organizations at minimum are trying to find that one or two great talent developer who's a leader in the DEI function to help bring others along. But yes, this is a growing function, and there are many CDOs that I've talked to who are building the capabilities of their teams by bringing people in from other functions across the business.
Okay, so here's a couple of questions that might be a little bit more focused around coaching. So let's say if you're coaching or wanting to support a diversity leader, do you have a sense of what's the most, I'm going to ask two and then you can sort of decide which way to go.
Yeah.
What is the single most important step in getting traction? And then Jennifer Long asks, how do you handle backlash? So traction and backlash.
Yeah. So on the traction side, so coaching somebody to increase their traction. I mean, I think there's a little bit of it that's what we were described before, which is being able to be agile and adjust influencing style according to the audience that you are influencing. But I think the other part of that we didn't talk about is getting feedback, right? So
Beautiful.
what are the feedback systems that you can build in to help you mirror, like, how am I doing on my influencing? Who are the trusted sources that you will build into your influencing model to be mirrors for you, so you can see how agile are you, how are you adapting, how are you seen in the organization? I think is really, really helpful and important. I think, and I do think people who gravitate to this work are, again, very curious and empathetic in their listeners, and so I do think they're also very developmental on their own journeys. So I think being able to hear that feedback and have those feedback mechanisms in place is something that would resonate, I think, with a lot of people in this role already.
How can they use that to sort of get better and better traction?
Yes.
But also that it's also getting better traction isn't just about the person interested in DEI. It's also how can the larger system get continuously kind of traction and to get more informed about it. And in that, how would you help people deal with backlash?
Yeah. It's hard too to answer because backlash comes in different packages, I think. I think one of the things that's been interesting in this past year as well, I've heard people say that it's not politically correct to say that I disagree with anything that the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer says. I'm going to hold my tongue because I'm going to get called out. It's not appropriate for me to disagree. So a lot of the backlash actually comes in what I call like passive resistance. It's disengagement in the topic, not actively working against, but passively not engaging.
Right.
And that's hard to diagnose. It's hard to know when that's happening.
Yeah, I like the idea though that what you're saying, and this is a little controversial, which is nice. We could use more of this, which is, where's the space to say I don't believe in DEI? Like, oh my goodness, and sort of the idea of not silencing. Or I have one client who's the CEO of a Fortune 20 company, and it was his first time out. He's like, I'm so worried I'm going to use the wrong word.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
What are these words?
A lot.
I'm afraid that I'm going to alienate people.
Yeah.
So last, because we have about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes actually. And what about your own experience now? So you are basically whether or not you're labeled it, you are Chief Diversity Officer along with your partners. What has that been like for you and your own experience?
Yeah, well, and I think I do think I'm speaking for a lot of the candidates that I've gotten to know, that the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officers I've gotten to know across as well. Some of the things we've talked about today does require, these are roles of heavy influence. I think there is recognition that I feel every day that that some of the skepticism is not forward skepticism. It's what we were just talking about, right? So being able to diagnose when there is maybe even a passive resistor that I need to address, and what are the best ways to engage that person in a safe space and in a safe conversation, because you need those people to come along too. I've actually heard some chief diversity officers also say there's sort of 3 categories of people that you'll encounter, right? There are people who are the champions. That's great. They're going to get on board. There's people at the other end of the spectrum who actually are actively maybe working against, and it may be too challenging to take on moving those people. But the people in the middle who may be frozen in that middle space for different reasons, it could be fear that they'll say the wrong thing.
Mhm.
It could be, a feeling of even guilt sometimes, that I don't know enough or I haven't done enough. And that can sort of freeze people in place. It's not a productive feeling, right? So you're not in action mode. You're just sort of like frozen and stuck. Um, and it can, so there are different reasons why there can be those people who are sort of passive resistors in the middle, but that's a really powerful group to try to bring on board. Um, because they're not actively resisting, but they may have some questions and need to be opened up and understand a little bit more, right? Turn on that empathy antenna a little bit and appreciate why, for different reasons, whether that's, the warrior, lover, dreamer, or thinker reason, why there are reasons to really engage in this work. And I think the work of a chief diversity officer, and this is the work that I'm feeling, is like being able to recognize and acknowledge those things and take people on a change journey. And it's taxing. It is taxing. You oftentimes feel like it is a one person, one conversation at a time effort.
Mhm.
Um, what I believe to be true, and this is why I get really impassioned about working with senior leaders on these topics, is when senior leaders come to some realizations about and they get impassioned about doing this work as well, right? Building more diverse teams and building inclusive cultures. Because they're senior leaders, they have, like, their behavior scales. Other people in the organization model their own behavior against what they see at the top. And
Mhm.
so if senior leaders are engaging positively in this conversation, if Egon Zehnder consultants are really engaging positively in this conversation, we all have the power to drive incredible impact out
Mhm.
elsewhere in the organization. And that gives me personally the energy to keep going in these one by one by one conversations, because each one of those conversations impacts like 10x
Mhm.
maybe, the
The
person that you're sitting across from.
rippling out. Oh, that is a lovely way to end, how each one of us also can ripple out, helping other people get more comfortable talking about this.
Mhm.
So I'm really struck, those of you who are listening, I really appreciate your questions. They have been really fabulous. We haven't answered all of them. And Cynthia and I will be doing a LinkedIn Live this coming Wednesday at noon Eastern. And I'll take some of these questions still. But if you have some more questions, please, what you can do is we'll have something posted on the Institute so that you can just put your questions there. And if you are still on now and some questions haven't been answered, quick, put them in. And then we'll work on answering them in our LinkedIn Live on Wednesday. So thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for this,
Thank
and
you,
thanking you
Carol.
in advance for next Wednesday. And for those of you who've joined and been part of today, thank you. So.
Thanks everybody for your engagement in this topic.